So, hello everyone. We may start our session. Today we are going to discuss dynamic approach to social housing in the Central and Eastern Europe region. Is it possible? Is it feasible? Is it a good idea? I think we are not a full house yet. We are waiting for one more speaker to join, but let's start and let's hope that he will join us in a few minutes. Social housing in Eastern Europe was discussed yesterday during the breakout session where Habitat for Humanity national directors were providing their views and thoughts on social housing in our region. And in my opinion, the main conclusion was that there is at least one significant similarity in the region, which is a significant deficit of social housing. So after privatization of social housing, the changes that we observed in 90s and later on, diminishing stock of social housing, we think that maybe it's time to look for new alternative or additional solutions. And that's why today we would like to discuss a dynamic approach to social housing. Can social housing be used as on rotational basis? One household is using it and then is providing it to another household who is still in housing need. And there are some people whose situation got better and can go, for example, to private market. How is it organized? Could it be organized better, or is it a bad idea for Central and Eastern Europe? Today, we are having great presenters that will be discussing this subject. I would like to present you Dr. Georgi Georgiev from New Bulgarian University, Ms. Vera Kovacs, founder and CEO of From Streets to Homes Association, Ms. Grażyna Szotkowska, President of Board at Szczecińskie TBS, and Ms. Marta Giannakopoulou, Director Architect at UIA Urban Experts. And I would like to inform also the audience that the interpretation of, because I'm seeing that the more people are joining, so I will repeat myself, the interpretation of the Polish part to English will be provided after the Polish speaking speaker stops speaking. And I would like to encourage all of our participants and all of everyone in the audience to take active part in our discussion. So please put any of your thoughts, comments, questions to chat, and we will try to answer everything or take it into consideration in the discussion. So without further ado, Georgi, please, could you please provide us with your incentives, your ideas on the dynamic approach on the situation in social and municipal housing in the Central and Eastern Europe?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to participate at this prominent forum. In order to clarify the picture with social housing in Eastern Europe, we have to look back for some historical background, especially the period after World War II, so-called totalitarian state period. So if we look at that period in all of Eastern European countries, the planning, development, and construction of new housing was almost fully implemented by the state and almost fully consisted of erecting multi-story apartment buildings. And the political doctrine that prevailing that time, all parameters of the building in quantities, in quality, in financing were strictly determined at centralized way. As part of a central planning economy. So the majority of these buildings erected during this time operated as public rentals, while some smaller part was owner-occupied in the form of apartment multi-story buildings or condominiums, There are some differences in some countries, like in Bulgaria, where the government transferred immediately the ownership on the building, on the apartments to the tenants. But generally speaking, a lot of public rentals were erected during this period in Eastern Europe. And the whole housing system was generally deeply subsidized by the state, open to all citizens. So it should be emphasized that the definition of social housing was incompatible with communist ideology, because it was officially declared at that time that the entire political system is social, based on universal equality and solidarity. So it was unacceptable for the state to recognize that some people are living below some standards of income. That there are some poor peoples or homeless people, etc. As a result, in Eastern European countries, housing policy was applied to all population. In this sense, it was never recognized the need for social housing, aimed only on specific groups of society. Thus, in paradox, the entire housing stock in these countries was actually social housing. The newly built during socialist time housing stock was generally subsidized, generally distributed, and actually it was it could be considered as a social housing. What happened after the changes in 90s of the last century? It was a huge process of privatization of this housing stock, mainly existing mainly in multi-story apartment buildings. So forced privatization took part, and apartments in these condominium buildings, in these public buildings, public apartment buildings, were sold to their sitting tenants, to the tenants living in these apartments. So the level of home ownership was instantly increased to up to around 90%. That is far beyond the average figure of about 60% for Western Europe. In addition, it was a problem, of course, because new homeowners had few resources. There was a lack of knowledge, a lack of legal framework to manage these newly privatized buildings. So, as a result, in all Eastern European countries, a problem of maintenance of this newly privatized housing stock arose. And all this situation creates problems of existing housing. Of course, some countries did develop some new municipal housing stock, or some cooperative housing stock inherited from previous political regime also existed. But in general, we could say that old housing provision system before political changes has been removed, demolished, but still proper new system was not put in place. We have a lot of problems in this respect: distorted tenure structure, low affordability, low quality, low energy efficiency, overcrowded dwellings, lack of supportive housing finance framework, only general subsidies, for example, for energy retrofits of owner-occupied apartment housing, which is actually a waste of public resources, insufficient targeted subsidies for specific low-income residents and for specific social housing suppliers. We have, of course, generally a lack of adequate legal framework. So what will be the future for housing, for social housing? Do we need social housing in Eastern Europe? So speaking generally, we could have two possible ways for the development, for solving a housing issue in Eastern Europe. The first is creation of authentic social housing in the manner of Western European countries, developed by bought by municipalities or social housing companies at municipalities or according to a special legislation. Or the second way will be to keep subsidizing in general, with general subsidies, condominium housing through retrofit projects. We have a lot of examples in Bulgaria also, when we have the state is subsidizing owner-occupied condominium buildings for renovation purposes up to the 100% of the cost, which I think is highly unsustainable. So, of course, my opinion is that we have to develop for Eastern European countries social housing development of social housing institutions, of social housing companies, social housing institutions, social housing legislation, which will target the intervention of the state to the needy people in need, and to the specific newly created by a special legislation housing companies. We have such companies existing, for example, in Poland or in some other countries, but I think we have a lot to do in Eastern European countries in order to improve the situation. We have in general to change the tenure structure, because we have now in Eastern Europe very high percentage of owner occupancy. As I mentioned, over 90%. This should be changes through two type of measures. First, by building new social rental housing by specific bodies, entities created according to a special legislation. And the second is by conversion of some existing condominiums into social rentals through the process of their energy efficient refurbishment, which is some controversial issue. But I think this will be also some of the ways to diminish extremely high owner occupancy rate. So we should not mix housing retrofit projects made with general subsidies. We should not mix this type of projects with social housing itself, with specific social housing developments, which is always should be done with specific targeted subsidies. So in this process of creating of new social housing according to the newly appeared economic and political changes, the crucial role will be should be for the legislation, for development of proper specific housing legislation in Eastern European countries. So maybe I will finish at this point. Hello?
I'm afraid we can't hear you, Katarzyna.
Sorry, okay.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay. So I was saying that, Georgi, many thanks for your great presentation and the historical approach to this issue, also for the way of looking forward and the solutions that are ahead of us. And I think that Vera's presentation will complement yours in a very, very nice way. So Vera, up to you.
Okay, thank you for having me today. And I brought you a small presentation on the Hungarian situation. So I will share my screen. And I believe that now you can see the starting page of my presentation. And yes, I am happy actually to talk after Georgi, because when I was thinking about the possibilities of dynamic approach to social housing, then I was thinking that it is actually the lack of stock and the lack of proper legislation that would prevent Eastern European countries to use a dynamic approach to the existing social housing stock. So let's see what do I mean? What does it mean for Hungary? As you may saw, I work for From Streets to Homes Association, and we are providing housing for the most vulnerable people, especially families breaking out from homelessness. So when we think about what Hungarian housing crisis consists of, then I have to mention that there are many, about 15 to 25,000 people living in the streets or on shelters in Hungary. But when we talk about housing crisis, it is obviously not only homelessness, but about 1/3 of the population having problems with financing or maintaining their housing somehow. And this data is actually coming from the yearly report of Habitat for Humanity Hungary. So they are providing data on housing poverty year by year. And then the problems of housing services is actually a lack of different services. So we have homeless shelters, we have social housing system, and we do have NGOs working on the field. But all of these are at a very insufficient, both in number and in financing, and also the people for whom they can provide the services to. So I brought you some numbers. The share of public housing is only 2% when it comes to the whole of Hungary, and it's 4.5% for Budapest. So I brought you two charts to underline this. One is the decreasing of social housing during the time. So you can see that the decreasing of social housing is still an ongoing process. So as in Bulgaria and as in other post-transition countries, we had privatization in Hungary, but it's not really correct to talk in past tense about it, because of course the vast majority of properties were sold off just after the transition, but the stock is still decreasing year by year. So this should be stopped from happening. And then there is, of course, financialization of the property market. So flat prices are actually skyrocketing, whether you think about buying prices or rental prices. My colleague Balint Misetic made this chart to pair incomes with prices, and the increasing of incomes is absolutely less than the increasing of flat prices. So this all makes affordability not only a problem of the most deprived or the lowest income households, but for many. So when we start to think about dynamic approaches to social housing, then we would say that many people can happen to be in a situation during their lifetime that they would actually need some sort of affordable housing. But when for Hungary we come to check the incomes and the flat price and the rental price rates, then it is pretty obvious that it's also a middle class problem. And when it comes to the housing expenditures of the government for the past decades, then we can see it's pretty hectic and it's decreasing. Even if the need for social housing is pretty clear, or social or affordable housing. So I don't think that only the strictly said social housing is a necessity, but when we come to talk about housing policies and dynamic approaches to social housing, then we actually have to talk about different target groups. So I have to say that we are in need for different solutions in many fields, and this will be pretty much parallel with what the previous speaker explained to you. So there is a need for housing affordability for many target groups based on age, or based on social situation, based on income, or based on financial or social deprivation. Then there shall be housing stock increased. So, I mean, there is not very much to talk about this. In Eastern Europe, this tenure structure is really not suitable for social policy-based housing thinking, because of just the lack of proper public stock. And then in Hungary, we don't actually have a representative in the government responsible for housing. So obviously, a parliamentary level representative responsible for the field would help solving the problems. And I don't exactly know how the situation is in other Eastern European countries, but I do know that in some EU countries, they do have governmental level representatives for the field, so it is not impossible what we ask for. Then I did show the chart of housing expenditures, and I feel that housing expenditures should be fixed by law. I mean, this should be a ratio of GDP or a ratio of social expenditures, so that people and decision makers could actually think about how they can count on public housing or social housing sector. Then I feel that we do share this problem, that private market has to be regulated, because obviously when there is a very low share of social houses, then and private market is not regulated, then there is a very big gap between the rental prices of the social housing market and the private market. Then people will be left without solutions, and this would also prevent families from using social houses for a temporary solution, because stepping out the private market is such a big step that it's not plausible for anybody basically to make it. Then we need obviously new stock and new financing forms too. And of course, we have to address the right to housing for the most deprived. So when it comes to our cooperation with Habitat for Humanity Poland, we actually came up with an idea of increasing stocks that could help these ideas happen. And this is the scaling up of social housing and social rental agencies in Eastern European cities. And in the previous years, we've been sharing two pilots and a scale-up project about this issue. And we've set up a plan to increase the stock by launching social housing agency in Budapest. And I do know that other cities are working in that too. So the main ideas in launching the agencies would be affordable prices for more target groups, and then we could integrate housing and social services, and we could have social policy relevance in the housing field. And actually, I brought you the plan. I brought you the plan, what we have prepared during this project, but I don't know, Katarzyna, how much time do I have to share it or not?
Vera, I'm very sorry, but we are running out of time, and we really need to go to the next speaker. So many thanks for your presentation.
Okay.
As you know, I would love to hear more. Yeah? Just one last sentence.
I will just post the link. Yes. I will just post the link of the housing agency plans to the chat section, and the articles are available in English too. Okay.
Okay, many thanks, and Well, you all know that in Habitat for Humanity Poland, we love the social rental agencies model. So I would love to go more in depth for that, but I'm passing to Grażyna, who is also going to discuss some great approach of one of the Polish biggest cities with their approach to social housing and what they are doing there. So Grażyna, over to you.
Dzień dobry Państwu, witam bardzo serdecznie. Ja w odróżnieniu od moich przedmówców
Welcome everyone, and in contrast to previous speakers,
chciałabym przedstawić Państwu, jak można realizować budownictwo społeczne na przykładzie jednego z miast polskich, konkretnie miasta Szczecin.
I'd like to show you an example how social housing can be developed, and I'd like to give you an example of one of Polish cities, the city of Szczecin.
Wszystko, co moi przedmówcy powiedzieli odnośnie sytuacji mieszkaniowej w krajach Europy Środkowej i Wschodniej, ma też odzwierciedlenie w warunkach polskich, ale pozwólcie Państwo, że ten wątek pominę.
Everything that previous speakers have said regarding social housing is also true about Poland, but let me skip this topic at the moment.
Ponieważ reprezentuję spółkę prawa handlowego z udziałem 100% gminy miasto Szczecin,
Since I represent a commercial law company which is 100% owned by the city of Szczecin,
to chciałabym Państwu w krótkich słowach przedstawić, jakim narzędziem realizacji lokalnej polityki mieszkaniowej mogą być tego typu podmioty.
I'd like to briefly tell you about how such companies can be a tool for local governments to implement their housing policies.
Wszystko zależy od tego, i w jaki sposób zostanie ustalona przez samorząd lokalny, bo o takim mówimy w warunkach polskich.
Everything depends on how the local government, especially in Poland,
Lokalna polityka mieszkaniowa miasta.
adopts the local housing policy.
Jeżeli miasto jako właściciel spółki TBS, Towarzystwo Budownictwa Społecznego,
If a city as the owner of the social housing company,
to jest spółki prawa handlowego, ale działającej non-profit,
a commercial law company but operating on the non-profit basis,
uzna, że dzięki powołaniu tej spółki będzie miasto mogło realizować szeroką, racjonalną i elastyczną politykę mieszkaniową.
so once the city decides that such a company can be a tool for implementing a broad and rational and effective housing policy,
To takie możliwości prawo polskie dawało miastom od 1995 roku.
There has been such a possibility for Polish cities to go for it since 1995.
Tego typu spółki przede wszystkim budują, modernizują i przebudowują i zarządzają majątkiem własnym lub na zlecenie.
And such companies build new housing stock, modernize existing housing stock, and provide the management of the housing stock as commissioned by the city.
Mogą zarządzać także majątkiem stanowiącym własność miasta, własność komunalną.
Such companies can also provide management to the housing stock owned by the city, the municipal housing stock.
Żeby Państwu przybliżyć możliwości, jakie mamy w Szczecinie, podam kilka danych cyfrowych.
In order to tell you briefly about the possibilities that we have in Szczecin, let me quote some figures.
W Szczecinie mieszka niespełna 400 000 mieszkańców.
The population of the city is slightly less than 400,000 people.
Zasób mieszkaniowy stanowiący własność miasta to ponad 16 000 mieszkań.
The housing stock is slightly more than 16,000 units.
Zasób mieszkaniowy stanowiący własność spółki szczecińskie TBS to ponad 7 000 mieszkań.
And the housing stock owned by the Szczecin TBS, that is the company, is slightly more than 7,000 units.
Czyli na dzień dzisiejszy w Szczecinie mamy ponad 23 000 mieszkań o charakterze społecznym.
So today in Szczecin, we have more than 23,000 social housing units available.
Te mieszkania są wykorzystywane nie tylko dla potrzeb najmu socjalnego, czyli przekazywane dla najuboższych,
This stock is used not only to support the lowest income people,
ale także dla tych o niskich dochodach gospodarstw domowych
but also those who have low income, for low income families,
oraz dla tych o średnich dochodach gospodarstw domowych,
and also the middle income families,
których nie stać na zaciągnięcie kredytu hipotecznego i nabycie własnego mieszkania.
those middle income families who are not capable of contracting mortgage loans and buying their own units.
Wielkość tego zasobu pozwala na elastyczne prowadzenie wszelkiego rodzaju działań związanych z zamianami, ze wskazywaniem innych lokali mieszkalnych o wyższym standardzie technicznym i funkcjonalnym.
The size of the housing stock enables us to have a flexible approach and to offer a variety of different standards and quality.
Czyli oferujemy mieszkania na najem socjalny dla najuboższych,
And thus we offer units for the poorest citizens for rental.
oferujemy mieszkania na najem komunalny dla osób o niskich dochodach gospodarstw domowych
We offer municipal housing units for low income families.
i oferujemy mieszkania dla osób o średnich dochodach gospodarstw domowych.
And we can also offer units for middle income families.
Maksymalne stawki czynszu najmu w zasobach szczecińskiego TBS-u stanowią w chwili obecnej około niespełna 40% stawek wolnorynkowych.
And the rental rate for the municipal and social housing, the maximum rental rate is roughly 40% of that established at the market.
Oferujemy mieszkania dla ludzi młodych na początku swojego startu zawodowego.
And so we can offer housing units for young people at the beginning of their professional careers.
Dla młodych rodzin z dziećmi na okres stabilizacji zawodowej i finansowej.
We offer units for young families until they reach occupational and family stability.
Kiedy te młode rodziny i młodzi ludzie będą już w stanie finansowo zabezpieczyć sobie mieszkania własnościowe lub własne domy, generalnie opuszczają nasz zasób.
And once those young families are capable of contracting mortgage loans, they basically do so and leave our housing stock.
Mamy także możliwość oferowania mieszkań dla osób starszych.
We also have the possibility to offer units for elderly people.
Takich, którzy na przykład mieszkali na mieszkaniach dużych, trzypokojowych, a dzisiaj chcieliby mieć mieszkania mniejsze, dwupokojowe.
So people who previously lived in large apartments, 3-room apartments, and now they would like to move to smaller apartments.
Pani
smaller
Grażyno,
units.
Staramy
proszę w ciągu
Halo?
minuty.
Thank you.
Pani,
Thank you. Everything okay?
Pani Grażyno, proszę kończyć w ciągu minuty, bo mamy mówców, dobrze? I pytania.
Dobrze, już kończę. To w takim razie na koniec poproszę, jeżeli to jest możliwe, o włączenie slajdów ze zdjęciami.
Could you, yes, I'm approaching the end of my intervention, so could you please display slides that I have sent to you?
Może mi Pani pomóc w tym zakresie?
Can you please help me displaying the slides?
Bardzo proszę. Proszę Państwa, tak wyglądają budynki nasze.
These slides show the buildings as they are at the moment.
Może następny. Ja bym
No,
chciała tylko,
another
żeby
slide,
to... Proszę o przewijanie tych zdjęć z 5-sekundową przerwą.
Can you please let the presentation go?
Proszę Państwa, tak wygląda centrum Szczecina.
This is the actually picture of the center of the city of Szczecin.
I wszystko to, o czym mówiłam do tej pory, to jest jeden z naszych najświeższych projektów.
And everything I've referred to so far refers to one of our latest projects.
To jest działka położona w centrum miasta i takie mieszkania będą za chwilę w centrum miasta.
The plot is located in the core city center, and very soon we're going to have such units available there.
Widać, że trwają prace budowlane.
You can see the ongoing building process.
A tutaj kolejne 4 slajdy zdjęć efektów pracy naszej spółki. Tutaj mieszkają...
For more slides, we've already existing effects of our projects.
Okay, thank you very
W tych
much.
budynkach...
Pani Grażyno, musimy...
Dziękuję bardzo.
We need to move to our next...
Ja już skończyłam. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. Just two information for our audience. As we are running out of time, I will not be doing any wrap-ups or any discussion. I am very sorry for that. The presentations are really interesting and I hate to interrupt our speakers. And we have 2 more speakers to come. So I will ask Ms. Marta Giannapoupoli and then Mr. Wolfgang Amann, who joined us right now. Hello. There were some technical issues, as we mentioned before, but we will hear also from Wolfgang at the end. So without further ado, Marta.
Hello, Katerina, and thank you for inviting me. It was very interesting, all the until now speeches, and I learned a lot. Greece is quite different to what already we've presented and very similar to other areas. I would like to give you some insight and discuss challenges and opportunities of the housing context in Greece, and in particular in 2 urban areas as Athens and Thessaloniki. Also, would like to talk about the efforts, the housing efforts that have happened since Greece that has no housing stock. So, as you might maybe know also from the state of housing that was published, Greece has 0% of social housing. Also never had social housing in the sense of the municipal or the public sector providing and building social housing. So, as you also may know, Greece since 2008 has been hit by a huge economic crisis and also by a refugee influx in 2015. That has been a major decline in national wealth and household income, costing Greeks losing their income to a large. So at the same time, with not having any social housing, households had to pay more than 40% of their household's disposable income into housing. Since 2015, about 14-15, also housing rents have gone up. And that is due to the fact that there has been a large touristification of Athens and Thessaloniki. So you would, it's because a lot of hotels or Airbnbs were made. There's a huge lack of policy on social housing, so providing social housing. So it's an unregulated market. There is a huge lack of data. So it's very difficult to understand how many people are homeless or how many people are in the process of eviction. But at the same time, due to the refugee influx in 2015, many apartments were taken by NGOs to house refugees. So all of these, also with the fact that there are not any housing, the very, very small housing programs by the Greek government, has led to having, as we know, a kind of very difficult, let's say, supply of housing, or difficulty for people to find housing. But at the same time, Greece did develop very quickly, and had to develop very quickly, I would say, innovative, smaller programs that were able to face the challenges that came up. So at the same time, in 2015, UNHCR created the first housing, I would say, social housing program, which was called Estia. This supplied housing for 25,000 refugees, 5,000 apartments in 14 cities across Greece. And this was the first time the program provide direct housing to the target group within urban areas. And they immediately, what happened is they used the private market to rent apartments with NGOs, with many NGOs that took part in the program, and then sublet the apartments for free to refugees. This accommodation program was a supply of free housing for 6 to 12 months, depending on the asylum status. Then the government created the second program, which is called the Helios, the IOM program, which basically did a rental subsidy. So all of the programs moved after this year to a rental subsidy. So there was a rental subsidy for refugees and asylum asylum seekers, and then there was a rental subsidy for vulnerable Greek families. So these were two different, though, programs, not unified to one housing framework. At the same time, the smaller programs that were developed through the municipalities and through some different areas in Greece were called the Housing and Employment Program, which seek to not only house people, but actually to create an environment that they can also find work. So they related the housing with the employment, which I find also very, very interesting to do. So that housing is not only one part of the program. But these programs were very small, meaning that the target group would be 1,000 people, or for example, the rental subsidy would cover 500,000 of people. But that still doesn't cover the current issues that Greece is facing. So what I could summarize in all of this is that these short-term programs do provide relief, do provide a very good part of subsidies, but do create an unsustainable programming, because people after these programs, that they graduate, don't have any other solutions. So most probably they would actually go back to the previous state. So it's not a development. And if we would take the housing first model, or if we take other housing models, the housing should be a process. It is not something that you provide once and that's it. It is a process for a lot. And of course, for each target group, there should be a different, possibly, program that could help out. Of course, now we are also at the same time having a higher percentage of people, of middle-class people, needing assistance. At the same time, we have much more homeless, also due to the COVID pandemic. But with the refugee, we're facing the cliff edge housing scenario, I would say, which is that people enroll in these programs, and then, as we said, after 6 to 12 months, are faced with homelessness.
Okay, Marta,
there is
wrap up.
Okay.
One more speaker, please.
Okay.
Final thought.
A final thought, that especially in Greece, the scenario would be best to actually create more housing stock, actually from zero, create new housing stock, but also create new housing-led approaches that can create innovative quick solutions in relation to a bigger, long-lasting, sustainable framework.
Thank you. Wolfgang, over to you. Last 4 minutes for you. And I'm saying also already goodbye to the audience.
Yeah, thank you, and sorry for the technical problem. I find the question of the breakout session, a dynamic approach to social housing and organizing social housing as one of the elements of one's housing career, quite difficult. As a matter of course, everybody wants cheap housing and wants to keep it as long as possible. That's natural, isn't it? In some cases, it is similar to a jackpot in a lottery to get a contract in social housing. If you want to do something, if you want that people would move out of the housing stock after a while, you can do some measures with pull and push factors. So you can pull people due to offers in other sectors, and you can push them out of the social housing sector. So for the main pull factors, it is very probably an attractive housing alternatives. People want to improve. For example, they want to move from social housing to single family homes, but of course this must be affordable. And if they are able to improve their housing situation, you have to make sure that they would return the social house, the social apartment for other tenants. In many cases, they won't do. They just would keep it as it is cheap. And regarding main push factors, I think there is not that many options. You can implement limited terms of contract. For example, that after 3 years, the tenant is evaluated, and only in the case that he is still feasible for social housing, he would get another contract. Or the second option is rent contracts which are close to market level. Or if social housing has poor quality, of course, that's another option. But none of these pull and push factors is actually very attractive. Actually, they are either unrealistic or politically unfeasible. This is, of course, not a very satisfying answer to the question of this breakout session, but let me give you only 3 examples of how we handle this challenge in Austria. For example, in Salzburg, there you have a rent level in social housing, in public housing, which is close to the market level, and reliable social tenants would get a discount of this rent level. So they pay, instead of €9 per square meter, roughly only €5 per square meter. After a couple of years, this will be evaluated, and if they are still fit for social housing, they would get the discount further on, and if not, they would have to pay the €9, which is close to the market level. In another place, Vorarlberg, they apply limited rent contracts. So after 10 years, again, the situation is evaluated, and if the household is not fit for social housing anymore, he has to look for a housing alternative. And last but not least, Vienna. Here we have a huge housing stock of roughly 200,000 housing units, and here actually there's no problem at all if a tenant would decide to stay in municipal housing even for 40, 50, 60 years until the end of his life. So this is my contribution. Thank you very much.